Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to our next in a series of techUK talks as part of London Tech Week. This session is on digital ethics and, the question, are we on the right track? My name is Catherine Holden and I head up our data analytics and AI program at techUK, and I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic lineup of panelists for this session. We have David Frank, who is the UK Government Affairs Manager at Microsoft, Felicity Birch, who is the new Executive Director for the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, Jen Rodbold, who is the Head of Digital Ethics and Tech for Good at Suppresteria, and Arnav Joshi, who is the Senior Associate and Digital Ethics Lead at Clifford Chance. So welcome everyone, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Before we kick off the discussion, and I know there's a lot we'd like to discuss during the hour we have, just a little bit of housekeeping. So we'd like to make this session as interactive as possible. So if the audience do have any questions, please do type them in the chat function below and I will be monitoring that throughout the discussion. Also, if you like to use social media, Twitter, etc., then please tag us at techUK using the hashtags hashtag LTW, London Tech Week, and hashtag techUK Talks. So just to give a bit of background, a bit of context to why we're running this session, many of you may know that this year, on the 8th of December, techUK will be running its 5th Digital Ethics Summit. So today we've really brought together the great and the good to really, I guess, sort of reflect on the progress that's been happening within the digital ethics community over the past 5 years. Obviously, in recent years, we have experienced some really significant developments across the technology policy landscape, and many of the stakeholders, industry representatives on this call have been working really hard to progress, I guess, a wide range of initiatives to ensure that ethical practices are at the heart of the latest technological developments. So this morning, we'd really like to consider how much have these activities moved the dial, and are they genuinely addressing the current key ethical challenges? Also, we hope, if we have time, we'd also like to look a bit more into the future as well, and really look at, I guess, identifying some of the biggest ethical challenges that are on the horizon, and assess whether the digital ethics community is prepared to, or is ready and prepared to effectively resolve these issues. So without further ado,
I don't know how that works.
maybe David, if I can hand over to you first, just to give a bit of an introduction. If you wouldn't mind just putting yourself on mute, I can hear a bit of background there. Thank you. David, if I could hand over to you to begin with, would you mind just giving us a bit of introduction first, of course, to yourself, your role at Microsoft, but then also maybe some brief reflections on developments within digital ethics over the past 5 years.
Sure. Thank you, Catherine, and hi everyone. I can't see who's joined the session, but I'm sure we've got a good audience with lots of people who want to be part of the conversation. So, as Catherine's already said, I'm David Frank, UK Government Affairs Manager at Microsoft. I've been in the company soon 5 years, so that mirrors sort of the sort of Tech UK conferences and the sort of development of the sort of conversation around digital ethics and what does that term mean and how's it applicable. And it's something that is part of my role here in the UK, and that I've sort of been engaging with policymakers and regulators on, but also more broadly, the company, as many of you will be aware, is sort of thinks quite deeply about, and we talk publicly about where our sort of thinking is going around the responsibility we have as one of the big global digital engineering businesses, and that's very much how we see ourselves. What responsibility do we have to our customers, our partners in society? And when your sort of company ambition is to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more, ethics has to be a sort of foundational principle within that. I mean, I think helpful if we look back over the last 5 years and remember, or try and remember, given how much has happened to all of us over the last 18 months or so, where the conversation was with regard to digital ethics. Certainly for me, it felt that 5 years ago, as I sort of got into that, joined that community of this conversation, there was a very live conversation in the sort of AI community, the digital ethics community, and businesses like Microsoft. But it stayed there, and some of that conversation was siloed, and sometimes it was cross-disciplinary, but it wasn't something that had a wider public dialogue or recognition about. And last night, whilst preparing for today, I sort of pulled out the 2018 AI sector deal that the government published, and that's within the last 5 years. I'm going to admit, did a word search rather than reading it cover to cover again, but the term ethics doesn't appear once in that document, and I think that's quite telling, because the document was very much focused on the societal benefits from a particular use of digital technology, AI, and had some sort of grand challenges that we're all familiar with, and were good and set the foundation for a lot of work that's happened since. But if you're setting a sector up or a technology up to do good, and you don't explicitly reference ethics, then I think that shows how the conversation has developed. I think what's changed, a number of people in different disciplines continue to talk and write about the importance of considering the impact of technology on society. We certainly have said, as a business, have talked a lot about that and thought a lot about it. And recognizing that technology can be used for good or ill. Brad Smith, our company president's book about tools and weapons, it was published now 2 years ago. Slight book plug, new edition out in all good bookshops, but is very much focused on that concept that you've got to think about the technology you build. And I think one of the markers of how the conversation has grown, again, last night I did a Bing search for the term digital ethics, 26 million hits back, which shows the growth, and those are a mix of links to pages on company sites like my own and some of the other big tech companies, academic papers, commentary pieces, but it just shows there's a live, vibrant conversation there. And I think that shows something's changed. And just putting it back to the UK, obviously the CDEI has come into existence, the Ada Lovelace Institute have come into existence within the last 5 years, and have both done sort of a lot of good work challenging businesses, again, like the one I represent, and government, to think through what are the societal impact of using digital technology, and what should people be aware of. And so I'll just close. I think if the challenge 5 years ago was about how to move the dial and have a societal conversation around digital impacts, digital ethics and the impact of technology we build, then that's definitely happened. There is a more vibrant conversation. But whilst that's cheering in many ways, I don't think we should rest on our laurels. That's definitely not job done. So to your final question to me, Catherine, was like, what needs to be done? I think as a society, we need to ensure that everybody has greater understanding of how of what a digital experience means, like how our online experience is shaped by algorithms. Now, that doesn't mean you need to know how you build an algorithm unless you wish to or professionally need to, but it's sort of building that understanding of how digital technology is used to shape the modern world in which we all function, whether you use social media heavily or you don't use it at all, or you use digital tools a lot or don't think you do, but everybody is on the receiving end of this technology as well as using it. And I think that's, for me, and we can unpack this, I guess, but that for me is the next stage in what a conversation around digital ethics needs to be, is like, how do you build that understanding, as well as having an agreement like which ethical code. And I know that's something the techUK Summit has talked about in the last 2-3 years. Like, when we talk about ethical codes, what do we mean by that? But I'll pause there because
Thank you, David. A lot of food for thought there, and I'd like to come back and revisit some of those points you made at the end around education and skills, and exactly which ethical code do we all adopt? Huge questions there. I'd like to now maybe just pass over to Felicity. Obviously, Felicity, you're new in your role at the CDI, so welcome. And obviously, as you said prior to that, at the CBI, but the centre has very much been part of this momentum. So it makes sure that digital ethics rises up the agenda, and is certainly a huge contributor to the reason there's been such an explosion in this area. What are your sort of thoughts and observation over how the digital ethics landscape has maybe changed over the past 5 years?
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for the introduction to the CDEI there. Just for people on the call who aren't aware, so the CDEI, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, essentially exists to help responsible data innovation to happen in the UK. And looking at the journey that data ethics, digital ethics has been on in the last 5 years, it's certainly a very interesting one from my perspective. Catherine, you mentioned that I used to be at the CBI, and in fact was there for 5 years, so have really seen this journey happen. And I think the level of awareness amongst the business community, and not just thinking about the tech sector, but also businesses who are looking to innovate in the tech space, has risen quite considerably. And we noted over that time quite a big increase in that sort of breadth of sectoral interest in innovating with data and investing in technology that involves algorithms. And alongside that, a lot of companies suddenly started to ask, well, I know I can do this, but should I do this? And I think being able to work through that question, it's tricky. That's essentially what the digital ethics, data ethics profession is there for, and I think a really important way in which CDEI can help. And I think David raised some really interesting questions there about sort of what frameworks are we talking about when we're talking about digital ethics. What values do we want to sort of propound and to work through? But for me, actually, I think there is a really fundamental question here as to why we're looking at this question. And ultimately, it's because we want digital innovation to do good. And ethics matters because the potential for innovation to do good will be held back if people don't feel that they can trust technology, and if innovators don't feel that they can use it safely. And I think 5 years ago, where we were is sort of trying to agree what good looked like. And so when the CDEI was founded back in 2018, the centre was grappling with some pretty fundamental questions about what matters to people, what are their expectations of technology, what are the risks when it comes to innovating with data, particularly looking at some of the most challenging and cross-cutting issues. So we did a lot of work around online targeting and bias in algorithmic decision making. And I think what's been really exciting is we certainly haven't been the only ones doing that. Since the CDEI was founded, first of its kind, more than 30 countries have created bodies tasked with piloting sort of similar national response on AI and data ethics. And globally, dozens of data ethics statements have been developed, and there's significant overlap. The OECD AI principles have been developed, which the UK has adopted. So we've got these high-level goals. We have quite a good sense of what we want data and data ethics to achieve for us. But that means that the landscape has to keep evolving. And for me, that means that policy makers and organizations together need to focus on the slightly different challenge of actually how do we put these principles into practice in a variety of contexts. And that's very much where we're looking to expand and sort of evolve our role in the centre. And our approach to that is sort of focused on two things around insight. So making sure that we do understand how the general public see data use. We have a dedicated public attitudes team who are looking to develop a deep understanding of the values that the public want to see reflected in models of data governance, what they really want data to do for them, and then working with both public sector and private sector bodies to support them through partnering and increasingly piloting models to help sort of deliver, test and refine trustworthy approaches to data and AI governance. And I'm really excited for this new chapter. We absolutely needed the last several years, but I think that this is the right place for us to move to now. And no doubt our role will continue to evolve as data ethics mature. And actually, I should say, it's one of the reasons I'm really delighted to be on this panel today, and also getting involved in other events at London Tech Week, because we need our community to help us achieve those things. If we want data ethics to be representative, it's really about engaging as many people as possible in what we're doing.
Completely agree. Thank you, Felicity. And I think it's, as you mentioned, a very, very exciting time for the centre. I know there's been a number of recent sort of announcements and developments, which maybe we'll ask you to sort of explain in a bit more detail in a little bit, but very excited for the future and what it has to hold for the centre. So thank you. And maybe Arnav, if I could come to you. Now, obviously, you're coming from a slightly different perspective, obviously, with the sort of legal background over the last 5 years, things have changed significantly. 5 years ago, we were just sort of starting to see the beginning of GDPR, etc. So what are your observations on the last 5 years and how things have evolved?
Yeah.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks for the introduction earlier. So, yeah, it has. I think, gosh, from looking back 5 years, it's hard to believe just how much progress in some ways that we have made. I think it was a bookmark sort of year in winter. So, as you mentioned, it was a sort of first techUK digital ethics summit. I was there then as a student. And I think we have made a huge amount of progress there in just sort of how much closer the work to digital or data ethics has come to becoming a household name. And if not fully a household name just yet, it certainly moved a lot closer to that point, especially in sort of policy and industry circles. So that's one. So I myself, for instance, was at that point busy penning my thesis on the epistemological scope of what data ethics even means, which seemed like an impossible question to solve at the point. But I'm happy to note that for the most part, great progress actually has been made in that space. As David and Felicity mentioned, so the CDEI had been signed off in, I think, the autumn budget that year. APPG, the Autumn Parliamentary Group on AI, was doing a lot of great work, and as you rightly mentioned, everyone was gearing up to GDPR, which, as we know, sort of deals primarily with personal data and its implications, but so many of the values, the principles that sit at the core of GDPR have a huge amount of overlap. So it was the first real weapon, if you will, the tool that many of us in this space thought we would be able to use to usher the first, wave of doing something concrete in this space, and sort of translating from page to stage, as it were. I think we've made a lot of really great strides in this space since. So there's been, as I mentioned, academic endeavors where so much of the work, it's important to note that the body of work in this space goes back many decades. Although the sort of regulation has only just started to catch up and then fill some of those gaps at long last. Those concepts ushered by policy measures and things like new regulators coming in, social pressures, geopolitical challenges started to transform more into what companies were doing, and obviously then fell to legal specialists such as myself to try and unwrap what that looks like. What are the gray areas? Because everyone looks to sort of piggyback themselves to some law, but where law isn't in place, but it's the right thing to do. Those were the sorts of challenges that we were dealing with, a lot of which have been cleared up since. So we do now know for constructs such as fairness, the judicious use of data, minimization, proportionality. These are all things that we have settled positions on in the last 5 years, which is a great thing to see. It's slightly on another part of the sort of policy and legal development has been the proactive industry approaches that tech workers have taken, whether that's through sort of the tech workers union and all of the things that are happening. There's digital rights of gig workers, a huge amount of development in that space, and things like whistleblowing, which has come out as such a powerful tool for genuine sort of regulatory and policy change in this space. And that's been very heartening to see as well. It all continues to be supported by very strongly by the courts of law, including here in the UK, as we would have seen in one of the more recent Supreme Court judgments on gig workers' rights for Uber drivers and others, as we've seen. And as we know, that regulatory landscape continues to evolve. We've had a huge sort of shot across the bow with the age-appropriate design code, now called the Children's Code from the ICO. A lot of my work over the last 18 months or so has been in that space. We're now looking into further strides in the space of online harms, which is going to start to make its way through Parliament. It's going to be another sort of huge driver. And then at the EU level, of course, we know that there's the AI law, the new sort of regulatory framework in that space that we can expect over the next sort of 18 to 24 months start to kick in. And lastly, I guess, somewhat more critically, I would think that the last 18 months have maybe highlighted some of the, if not accelerated the challenges that we do face in this space. They've highlighted what the problems are, but not too many of the solutions just yet. So I do think that we've been very focused on problem solving, let's get this done. How do we get this data from here to there? How do we innovate, get the vaccines out, get the tests, and so many other things going on, which from a data perspective is led to a whole new way of sharing and demanding, in some instances, data that none of us have been used to before. What the long-term or even the medium-term applications of this are going to be, I think, remain to be seen. And we may see some nasty things come out of the woodworks on what the new normal for sort of data selves is going to be going forward. So that's going to be a pressing issue for me, I think, as a legal practitioner, to help find the right balance, identify risks for individuals, for clients, etc. And then I guess there's also all of the, in the background, all of the politicking that's happening around data ethics and data more broadly, some of which I guess has been paused, given that we're in the middle of a global health crisis. But it does seem to go up, down, and sideways. In this country, for instance, I think post-Brexit, we are starting to see some of those tones of things like data nationalism, which we would otherwise have looked sort of down upon and seen as someone else's sort of a very Soviet-era policy to have. I'm not sure just how well that's going to land and what that sort of political messaging around data and data ethics, where that's going to take us. But my personal view in that is that I'm a lot more closely aligned to the sorts of messages that we were getting from our from government and key policymakers 5 years ago than I am now.
Thank you, Arnav. That's very, very helpful observations there. And I think, you just showed that there's the tremendous amount of work that's happening in this space. And, it very much is even just the start of the conversation. There's a lot of significant announcements that are sort of in the pipeline that can have a dramatic impact on how these technologies are able to be used and created and adopted. And some of you may have seen, obviously, this week we're expecting the publication, in fact, I think maybe as early as tomorrow, of the UK National AI Strategy. And in there, if you've seen the leaked article from the FT, there's the kind of a line that sort of implies there's going to be a national position focusing on kind of what AI governance and regulation in this space looks. So it's definitely a hot topic that isn't going away anytime soon, that we really need to be focusing on as a community. So thank you, Arnav. Jen, across to you. Would you mind just giving us a bit of an introduction to your role at Suppresteria and just your thoughts and observations on the last 5 years, which I know is a long period of time.
Thanks, Catherine. And going last is always the challenging part, because what can I do but nod and vigorously with what's been said before. So thanks, everyone. It's nice to be here. I'm Jen Rodvold from Suppresteria, and I look after our digital ethics and tech for good practice. And just putting us into the timeline, I mean, we set up our digital ethics practice, our first practice dedicated on this space, a team dedicated on this space, just at the beginning of last year, January 2020. And the reason we came into being, as it were, is because we saw, I guess, what a lot of the points you've heard from David, Felicity, and Arnav, that there was a lot of kind of really good groundwork laid in the academic space and done by technical people, but not a lot of translation of what digital ethics meant in practice to most corporations and public sector organizations. We saw that regulation wasn't keeping pace with the pace of technology. And even if it did, that ethical compliance isn't the same, regulatory compliance isn't the same as an ethics-driven approach, as Arnav has touched upon. So we wanted to kind of help organizations make make some shape out of some of the academic and abstract conversations that were happening. We also, and I'll bring it up probably as a broken record a few times today, that yes, AI ethics is important and data ethics is important, but even if we look to where kind of standards and guidelines have shaped this conversation, I think we sometimes miss some of the other aspects of what I think should be included in a digital ethics conversation. Arnav talked about the gig economy, so displacement, skills in the future of work. We need to bring that into the conversation. And of course, environmental sustainability and the role that digital and data can play both in promoting greater sustainability, but also making sure that we don't erode the progress that we've started to make on climate change with technology and data. So I think the other thing in terms of, if I think about a timeline in my head, we had this myriad of kind of guidelines emerging from organizations set up from 2017, and then a sharpening and a focus on what digital ethics actually means and some principles that are, if not universal, then generally accepted. And that's played a major role in helping businesses and the public sector kind of hang their work, hang their strategies on some ethical considerations with some consistency and the development of some shared language. More recently, I think probably in the last 2 years, there's been an emergence of tools and frameworks. So we go from principles and ideas to putting these things into practice within specific organizational contexts and strategies. And of course, the government's own data ethics framework has been one of those tools that we've seen increasing use of in our public sector client base. And then like the Open Data Institute's Data Ethics Canvas, which a lot of organizations are also using. And we're going to want to see more of that, I think, because the challenge that I'm sure we'll get into today is still the work to do on I'm going to avoid this word, operationalizing kind of digital ethics strategies and visions. On the research side, just to pick up on some points, I mean, what interests us really is the change in public sentiment and public consciousness. So to pick up on, you know, David's ideas about the importance of education, I think the time is right to think about skills and literacy and education, because digital ethics has kind of entered the public imagination for the first time in the last 2 years. If we look at research from .Everyone and the Edelman Trust Barometer, we see kind of a trust gap growing both towards the technology industry itself, but just generally in how businesses and governments are using data and thinking about using more advanced technologies. And if we believe, like I do, that trustworthiness and trust is really central to the success of digital transformation, as Felicity has talked about as well, then we need to make sure that we're really keeping an eye on or an ear on the public sentiment. And I think that's going to play a role in everyone's work going forward. So, I mean, I guess in closing, there's more to do. The pace has been good. We've achieved a lot. I think we all kind of are saying that. But because the technology sector moves at such a pace, and probably even more so in the last 18 months, we have to kind of double or triple down and really get a move on to deepening our impact in a practical sense in organizations.
Thank you, Jen. And maybe just sticking with you for a moment there, I think obviously a key point you mentioned there was around the operationalization, I'll just say it very quickly, of sort of these digital ethics principles, which is, you know, really key if we're going to sort of establish an impact in this area. Do you have sort of any examples or, you know, from your perspective, you know, from that client delivery perspective, how are you finding that ethical considerations are changing businesses' sort of decisions and practices currently?
So, I mean, it is a development area, I think, and there's a lot of maturing to do, but I think there are some really quick wins that we need to think about. So there is increasingly a recognition that some digital ethics issues must support and are aligned to, you know, this idea of purpose-driven business and sustainability and ESG issues. So a hack would be to examine an organization's purpose and vision and sustainability, diversity, all of those things, what they want to represent, and then to dig into how their digital strategy and digital program, their use of data, even down to the procurement level, matches or creates some sort of discord. And that sounds really simple, but it's not obviously in the real sense, but it does help organizations at least map where they might have some disconnect. And just in terms of our kind of mission statement, make things practical and real as soon as possible and get out of the kind of inertia of worrying about what seems like an overwhelming concern with a lot of digital ethics discussions. Just use what you've already got and focus on where you're trying to go from a purpose and sustainability point of view and map some of your digital programming to that. I would like to see more of these kinds of frameworks and tools. I mentioned already the data ethics framework and the data ethics canvas from ODI. What's really interesting that we've seen is when we use tools like that, we find, I think, perhaps some reluctance at the beginning to have a data ethics conversation until we start and we realize that we're having a data strategy conversation, and it is actually about transformation, because it uncovers some really interesting questions about what is behind an organization's obsession with becoming a data-driven organization and the data-driven business models that every organization wants right now. And those are big questions that need answering if a data strategy is going to be effective. So I offer data ethics exploratory tools like that and discoveries and kind of as is exploration versus where you want to be as just a really useful way of uncovering kind of some bigger important issues. And then finally, just to that point, it sounds obvious again, but data ethics needs to be a part of the data strategy and data literacy conversation. It shouldn't be siloed. It's not corporate social responsibility. It's not philanthropy. It's about being effective in delivering this promise of digital transformation and trustworthy business.
Thank you, Jen. That's very helpful. Maybe David, if I could just pass on to you, any sort of reflections on maybe what Jen said there, but also your thoughts on how, you know, Microsoft is kind of considering a lot of these ethical implications and how that's changed the way that your business operates.
I mean, picking up both points Jen made and Arnav and Felicity, I mean, that trust point is foundational for us as a business. I mean, we sort of say Microsoft runs on trust, but it's absolutely true. If consumers, customers, governments don't trust us, they're not going to talk to us and they won't purchase our technology. And so we've got to be really mindful of the trust people place in us when they use our tools. And so the sort of mirror to that is that when we make tools and solutions that can impact people's lives, we've got to think about what that means and sort of picking up that, sort of not picking that up and running with it a bit. So we had to respond to the age appropriate design code because we're in scope. Some of our services and products are in scope, and we had a choice. We could just comply in the UK because that was the focus of the sort of legislation, although it sort of was a bit vague on was it extraterritorial or just the UK, or could we take a sort of wider trust view and a sort of ethical view really and say actually these are what the age appropriate design code is talking about are issues that parents, guardians, grandparents, teachers around the world are going to be thinking about and talking about. And so that led us into, to your point about how have we responded, how we've changed, we sort of just without really having to have that conversation, it's like, no, we will need to work out what our obligations are, what changes we might need to make, or how do we talk about how we use data or don't use data. And we just, that became, we will do this globally. So whether you're in the UK or not. And so I think to that last point Jen was making about how this conversation is growing up and developing, I think that's a symbol of it within Microsoft. Like that it wasn't there was a brief debate in terms of what does this mean, and like, where are we on product roadmaps, which is absolutely fine as you try and work out your product cycle and obligations, as well as making sure that changes in one jurisdiction didn't break you into jail elsewhere, because that then is a challenge, and it didn't. But I think that shows how we've sort of grown and developed, and how the issue grows. I think the other bit where it's sort of a broader sectoral thing, and is obviously after the sort of awful murder of George Floyd, that sort of way the tech community came together. A number of the big tech companies, we were part of it, came together and just said, we're going to pause selling certain types of technology to certain types of customers because there is no regulatory environment currently in place. And so this absolutely horrendous tragedy is a moment in time which shook everybody, but also, sadly, it often takes those kinds of shocking external events to sort of bring a conversation to a point where it was like, what regulatory environment do we now need that underpins and supports a lot of these sort of conversations? And so again, in the US, we lobbied in Washington State, so where our global headquarters are, for sort of regulation that sort of, and hopefully the UK strategy tomorrow will reference some of this as well, but like accountability, auditability, so that people know that these tools are being developed and used, but also have a sense of, how do they have agency? How can they ask questions? Sort of our basic instinct as a person, like to ask questions. What does that mean in a digital world? So two different ends, but I think that shows how we, Microsoft, are approaching, but also how this is a journey that we're on as well. I mean, as everybody is.
Thank you, David. Arnav, maybe if I could come to you now, there's a number of areas during this conversation that I would like to touch on, but maybe just moving on slightly now to reflect on kind of, I guess, the current direction of government policies and strategies. Do you think enough is being done to kind of consider digital ethics as part of these policies that are being announced sort of very regularly at the moment? Are there, and I guess sort of supplementary to that, are there specific tech policy areas where you'd like to see more of an emphasis on ethics?
Sure, thanks. That's a really good and interesting question. I think the challenge that we're starting to see is there are certain areas of this that continue to be sort of unregulated in certain aspects. So sort of if we zoom out to the power centers of where tech nowadays is, and for a while has been developed. So we would traditionally look to the US and China. The developments in those areas, sort of regulatory and policy developments, although they have made progress in the last sort of 5 years, since that's the look back period that we're looking at, but it's not been quite nearly as substantial as we would have liked. So there is a slight gap there. And to pick up on what David was just mentioning, the sort of these shots across the bow globally, which are very strategically well planned sometimes by regulators and policymakers, but otherwise it just, as David was saying, it just makes sense, and you want to do the right thing. It's also most often a lower regulatory burden. With one of the other big tech firms, I think a lot of us would remember the story of how GDPR protections in the early days were rolled out only to European customers. And then customers in the US said, actually, can you please explain as a US company why we don't get the protections the Europeans do? So there do continue to be some of these sort of push and pull situations where there are some, I wouldn't say the UK is over-regulated, but we do have a lot by way of current and incoming regulation and policy measures and guidance, etc. Between Ofcom, the ICO, CDEI, regulations such as online harms, AADs, etc. that's on the anvil, and the ways in which we interpret GDPR and how the courts are interpreting it, how regulators are interpreting it. So it's a strong regime. But data doesn't sit in a silo. We're sadly at the moment not in a place where, when it comes to things like social media, and other certain commonly used everyday technologies. We're not really the power center from a development perspective just yet. So I think that regulatory and policy gap sort of tends to lie more with the governments in the geographies where it's being developed, where I think things like digital ethics continue to fill the gaps, those sort of gray areas which are much wider. That's leading to some very interesting things happening when you don't have a sort of regulatory guardrail to say this is what digital ethics will mean to you, which is sort of what is, reading between the lines, kind of what's starting to happen here, for better or for worse, mostly for the better, I would think. So we're still sort of in that space, my sense is, in some of those other centers. As I said, progress has been made, but some more sort of wider guardrails to help shape that policy and regulatory discussion, move it forward would be helpful. So we're starting to see things like the California the Privacy Act. We've seen sort of wider interpretations of COPPA. The FTC in the US is becoming more and more active on a number of issues. And then we've seen sort of the new data protection law in China now, and their digital ethics principles starting to come on. So are we going hurtling towards a culture clash, or does the UK sort of have a first mover advantage in some of these things, or the EU more widely? I think remains to be seen.
Thank you, Anna. And yes, certainly agree with that kind of coordination point and the current silos with lots of different work and activity happening across government, which is great. But obviously, from an industry perspective, having that sort of slightly more sort of coordinated, I think certainly would help from an application or a practical perspective for when looking to operationalize some of this guidance or regulation, particularly for our SMEs, as we know, who are maybe slightly more strapped with resources. Felicity, I'd like to come back to you. Obviously, as we mentioned at the beginning, you're sort of new to the centre, and there's been a number of really exciting announcements from the centre over the last few weeks. I was wondering if you'd mind taking a bit of a time to sort of explain some of those new changes, and obviously coming in new to the role, I guess, what your ambitions for the centre are.
Thank you. It feels like a big question, but one I'm really excited about, because I think unlocking responsible data innovation has the potential to deliver massive social benefits. It's also a multi-billion-pound economic question, and essentially, I want CDEI to be there to help answer it. And we've heard already from other speakers that ethics affects business decisions, it affects government decisions, and trust, as I think David put it, is absolutely foundational. And I think concerns about ethics are genuinely holding innovation back, and innovations that we would really like to see happening. And CDI has done some really interesting research here. So we found that a quarter of medium or large businesses identified uncertainty about how to put in place the right ethical governance as a barrier to development. And for sales, a little over 1 in 10 vendors we surveyed said that issues around governance, ethics, public trust are the greatest barriers to adoption. And 1 in 10 might not sound that big, but that's actually the same as the number of vendors who are talking about skills barriers. And we all know that skills barriers can be one of those things that really holds back innovation. And it bears out with my previous experience at CBI as well. So many businesses who are grappling with data innovation that can make a big difference for their customers, for their communities, told me that concerns about ethical implications, whether it's sort of be reputational or genuinely like grappling with sort of conflicting views about the right way forward, was holding them back from doing good things. And I spoke to one business leader who was saying to me, I don't know how to look under the lid. And I think a lot of people feel like that when it comes to innovating with data. And that's where the CDEI can step in, and we're already doing that. I've talked a bit about the multi-billion pound opportunity here. So one really good example is around autonomous vehicles. We reckon that there is the potential for an AV market worth £42 billion by 2035, but big questions about how you regulate that. So we're working with the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles to address some of those ethical and regulatory issues, and we are going to be piloting and testing solutions to address ethical challenges before we recommend how to operationalise the ethical due diligence. Oh, I didn't trip over operationalise, I tripped over diligence instead. But looking at operationalising that ethical due diligence in the legislation. So I just wanted to give that as a bit of an example, but really would like to be able to share just briefly with everyone else on the call the 3 key areas that we're going to be looking at over the next year, and where we're really going to be focusing a lot of our time. So one of them, the first one, is around data sharing and creating new models and supporting the development of new models for data sharing. So looking at things like data intermediaries and privacy enhancing technologies. Really exciting. For example, another big chunky £1 billion opportunity, looking at the potential growth of safety tech in the UK. It's a pretty nascent sector, but we think it could have revenue exceeding £1 billion by the mid-2020s. So we're partnering with colleagues in DCMS on the Online Safety Data Initiative to enable companies to share data that might be sort of personally sensitive, but also commercially sensitive, and develop new products and services that help keep people safe online and remove harmful or illegal content, which I think is really important, really aligned with a lot of key government goals, and something that does need that sort of intermediation to unlock it. We're also looking at AI assurance, and again, an industry that is emerging. We've talked about this a little bit already today, and where the UK has a real opportunity to be a global leader, particularly building on the strength of our professional services industry. So we're developing a roadmap, sort of setting out what we think a vision for a mature AI assurance ecosystem would look like, and critically, of course, the steps that we're going to need to take to get there. And then finally, the third key area of focus for us is around public sector data use and helping government departments and agencies to use data better to deliver better public services all across the UK. So, for example, we've been doing some work with Police Scotland to help develop inclusive governance for the use of data-driven technologies, which is clearly a really key issue around trust in policing.
Thank you, Felicity. Brilliant, and it's great to see, you outlined, I guess, what your priorities are for the next, year or two, and that's fantastic. And also great to see there's been obviously a refresh of the centre's board as well, with a number of industry representatives, including some techUK members, which is fantastic to see. And for those of you that didn't see the announcement, I have just put in the chat a link to Felicity's recent blog on the CDI website, which is definitely worth checking out. So thank you. We're very quickly running out of time, so I was wondering if we could maybe obviously just spend a bit of time looking, getting out our crystal balls and looking into the future and what maybe the next 5 years hold. Maybe Jen, if I could come to you, it'd be really great to kind of get your thoughts on what you see as the most important digital ethics priorities over the next 5 years. Now, I know there's probably many, so maybe if we could sort of just pin it down to 1 or 2 key priorities that you'd like to see us focus on, in the next few years to come.
Sure. Really exciting to hear about Felicity's agenda, and some of what I'm about to say, I suppose we'll link into that. Felicity, you mentioned it in your opening as well. I love that you brought us back to pilot and test and creating a space for innovation. And I think that that's going to be really, really important going forward. We need to be able to try new things in order to secure the promise of digital and data technology for public benefit, for societal benefit, and that can be scary, and I think that has been a blocker, so being able to do that will be critically important. The other thing I think people want to see, businesses want to see, is success stories. So we talk a lot about risk and the big stick of what will happen in terms of regulatory enforcement or reputational damage, and I think that that's not going to go away anytime soon. And it is a useful motivator, but it's not the only motivator. And I'd love for us to be sharing more success stories, what good looks like, what works, even though each business context is different. You know, we can be inspired by the progress others are making and learn lessons from them. And then, of course, I guess the other side of that is what doesn't work, and being courageous enough to share failures that were driven by good intentions. I mentioned data literacy earlier, and I think that is absolutely critical to driving this agenda. Digital ethics and data ethics is not going to be, it won't succeed if it continues to be the remit of practitioners, whether we're ethicists or technologists or legal specialists coming at it from a policy background. One of the biggest failings, I think, is that we as a society don't yet have a level of data literacy that enables us to spot where things aren't modeled right, and how to ask the right questions with data, and how to design the right data models, and then how to make sure that they don't go wrong later down the road. And we need organizations to be working on that at all levels. And I guess there is a public policy question there too, because we also need to start doing more with young people and making this part of their consciousness from an early age and their skill set from an early age. So I think I've given you 4 and you asked for 2. I'll leave it there, Catherine.
No, that's very good. Thank you, Jen. And I'm sure, just maybe moving on to you, David, that a lot of the things that Jen just mentioned there will resonate very strongly with you. I know you're very passionate about sort of the need to sort of focus more on sort of education, skills, understanding, and really, I guess, marrying up sort of ethics and impact to really sort of demonstrate how ethics, well, the impact it has on sort of the everyday person, not just, as Jen said, the practitioners and the academics, etc. Building on that, are there any other sort of reflections, anything else that you'd like to really see us marking as a priority for the next 5 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Echoing a lot of what Jen said, that sort of base level of understanding and knowledge. I mean, sort of thinking back to the report the CDEI did 2 years ago, maybe, on smart speakers. More and more of us have that kind of technology in our home, and it's valuable and adds to our lives. But the majority of people, thinking back to some of the data in that report, the majority of people didn't understand. Like, they thought, oh, this is a really cool speaker, I can ask it the weather or to play music or whatever it might be. But they didn't have a full grasp of actually how did that magic, and it is magical, like that ability to be entertained or informed is absolutely magical, but didn't have an understanding of actually what that data conversation really was. And by asking that question, what were you giving to receive? And I think that we have to, that to me has to be a sort of continued focus and priority. I mean, I think there's a bigger piece if you look at the sort of climate crisis. Prime Minister's in New York today for the UN General Assembly. It was all over the broadcast news this morning. It's a big ask to President Biden, put more money on the table from the US to sort of contribute to combating climate change. The response to the sort of public health crisis around COVID that we're all sort of still facing, those have technological solutions that are key, but they therefore have an ethical dimension that has to be there as well, because if you don't have that built in, you run risks. And I think from a business point of view, we've created internal processes that work for us, where we have a Office of Responsible AI headed by a sort of our Chief Responsibility Officer. There's sort of internal processes for people to flag concerns, and we drive to have diversity of teams developing it. So exactly to Jen's point around how you try and spot stuff at an early stage where minority communities may not be taken on board. Well, how do you deal with that, where you try and have diversity and sort of input into the team? And if you can't do that, at least recognize and mitigate. And I think there's a sort of education piece that a business like Microsoft has, and we take this seriously. How do we help our customers be informed? And just to close, I think our recent response to the European Commission's sort of policy paper on AI, which you could take a wider bit around digital, it really talked about thinking about where do regulatory obligations fall. Well, fundamentally, they've got to fall on the business deploying a solution, but the people who build it have to be part of that conversation. And so we sort of think carefully about that. and then it's sort of thinking about what's the desired outcome. And to an earlier point, I think Arnav or Felicity made around, just because you can do something doesn't mean you need to or should do it in that way. So creating an environment where people can have that honest conversation, I think has to be key as well.
Agree. Thank you, David, for those final remarks. Arnav, on to you. Obviously, I think we've established you've got a very busy time ahead of you with various different potential regulatory legislative changes on the horizon. But what, from your perspective, would you like to be seen prioritised? And I guess kind of what does good look like for you over the next 5 years?
Sure. So I think we've spent a lot of time asking for guidance and regulation, and now increasingly we have it. And Parliament will sort of legislate, and regulators will regulate. They always have, they always will. I think that there's sort of 2 points of unresolved conflict, if you will, or gaps that I would like to see addressed. One is on sort of what does this, what are the gaps that are being filled, and when we've allowed innovation to happen, let's say in the absence of some of these guardrails, what does that mean for being tech? So what's the conflict with regulators and others that's starting to frame, and how do we resolve it? I think sensible discussions and conversations and bringing those developers, as David said, along in these conversations makes sense. I think the regulators have a tough task, whether it's the IC or Ofcom and others, on carefully prioritizing what good enforcement means, or what enforcement even means, essentially, because I think we're all sort of broadly agreed that we're trying to be all on the same team. But there is, to me, this unresolved question of who knows best. Does the regulator know best? How often do we go to our sort of member of parliament or congressman and say, hi, I would like you to hold a consultation with this group of people on what data ethics means to us? To my mind, that's not something that we do very regularly. techUK works in that space. Ada Lovelace works in that space. The CDEI works in that space, and it's been increasingly doing a lot of really great work there. But I think a lot of big tech makes assumptions on what is best for their customers. A lot of the time that's driven by expert views, and they hire and pay people lots of money to make those calls. But I do think that along with education, we do need to take our customers, which include all of us, a little bit more seriously. And if every app that's on my phone asks me, once a fortnight, how my experience has been, and if I could take this short survey to help them understand how things are going, there's no reason that one of those quizzes could be our experience in how ethical, well, I say ethical, but how balanced, how fair, how sort of appropriate within their current understanding of the law and policy and this space things mean. And I know that sounds very loaded, but what I'm trying to get at is I think we do need to give the customers more agency here, and I think we'd be surprised with just how much we would get back.
Thank you, Arnav. Much appreciated. I'd just like to give the final word maybe to you, Felicity. Just maybe, as part of your observations, I know you've only been in the role for sort of a month or so, but any thoughts sort of in your role as to any changes, I guess, that are required to be made by the digital ethics community to make us more effective in making progress on some of the priorities the others have mentioned? Any observations there, or any calls to action for the digital ethics community that are on the call or rewatching this recording?
Well, I'll try and do that very quickly because I know we're nearly at time, but I think there are a couple of key things, building on everything that others have said, that the community does need to consider. And one of them that I think is a high priority is, as a community talking about ethics, we also have to hold ourselves to the highest possible standards, and particularly with regards to inclusion and diversity of the people that we engage with. It's true at the CDEI too. We've done a lot of work around equality, diversity and inclusion, but I think it's something that we want to keep getting better at. And actually that is something that I would put a call out to the community here to challenge us to engage with our work. We do really want to hear from you. And then the second point is actually making sure that we are engaging positively with the public on the opportunities from technology. And I think we've heard that from a lot of speakers already today, but it's absolutely core to our work. The whole point in digital ethics is making sure that technology works for people. So we need to make sure that people are engaged in the work that we're doing.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Felicity. That's a really good note to end on. So I would just like to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, to Felicity, to David, to Arnav and to Jen, and of course to our audience for joining as well. As I said, this session is being recorded and we'll make sure that a copy of this recording is made available with you shortly to share with colleagues. I think it just leaves me to say, don't forget, this is only day 2 of London Tech Week. Don't forget to check out the other events that we're running as part of our techUK talk series. I've just included a link in the chat. The one that may be of particular interest is the session we're running on AI competitiveness on Thursday afternoon, which will very much be getting initial reactions to the UK National AI Strategy. And we will also be joined by Sana Kiriani, who chairs and is the head of the Office for AI, to get her initial thoughts and explanations. So do attend that if you can. And it just leaves me to say, have a brilliant rest of day. And thank you so much for your time, everyone. Thank you.